so feel free to join on LinkedIn and have a chat. I'm working, of actually building quite some community also on LinkedIn, so feel free to join. But the background actually on the presentation is that during the last few years, I do a few hundred of actually, just almost 100 days of audit per year. And obviously, like you probably, most of my customers use cloud in one way or another. But during these audits, I got a lot of questions, and it's draw on my attention actually is that how to secure the clouds. And I focused a bit during these audits how my customers actually would secure their environments. And it was quite a bit of a surprising result actually when I start focusing on the cloud audits and the cloud security audits in that case. And that's what I wanted to share with this presentation a bit. Please be aware that at the end of the presentations, and I will work with a team of iExperts actually to make sure you get the presentation, but at the end of the slide, you will see some interesting materials actually that you can use actually and look into it. So next to the sessions, I hope you will have some additional material to look into implementing these red flags yourself, or actually fighting against the red flags yourself. So let's get started with it. But before we do so, I wanted to explain a few things you should be aware of, because if we're talking about cloud security in many cases, people usually focus on security from the technical perspective, and that is not entirely correct. So if we talk about security, you should think about the PPT principle, people, process, and technology. Although nowadays, and certainly if you're looking in the ISO 27001 series of documentation, you will also see that physical security is becoming quite important. I skipped it a bit in this presentation because, of course, in cloud security, mostly your provider will be responsible for managing the physical part of your security. Still, you're accountable to it. But in essence, the physical security is less important when talking about cloud security. It's not to be ignored, but still as important in many cases, right? So very important, if you think about security, also think about the technology, talk about the processes, and this is certainly within cloud environments a quite important one, because most of the people that are using cloud or subscribing to cloud implementations think that actually the cloud provider is taking care of the processes, which is not the case. And you will see in the top 10 of the red flags we will discuss that process management is one of the important things you should really consider or implement, at least to make sure that your cloud environment is secure. Another point actually of security is that most of the people joining cloud or using and consuming cloud solutions think it's only a technology solution, so the cloud will be fixed or will be maintained by the IT guys. But please be aware that as you will see in security best practices, the technical security is only one of the levels I discussed in the previous slide, but also from a tactical and strategic level, you need to be aware about the threats and the possible scenarios that can go wrong in cloud. So it's very important that also your departmental heads, or even worse, your CXO director level is aware of the cloud security issues. So you should have a proper discussions across the company actually to make sure that security is implemented not only on the technical level but also on strategic level. So it should be a well informed choice of the company going to cloud, and you will see actually in most of the cases it's rather a practical decision than it is a strategic level decision, and that is wrong, right? So I will explain later on what you should do actually to make sure that also you get your strategic level on board of the cloud security discussions. For that reason, also very important, and in most of the best practice, including the NIST controls or the SIS controls and the NIST implementation and the ISO, it's quite important to think about the management tasks for security. By the way, in most of the ISO documentation, you will see this configured or discussed in the clauses. It's all about accountability, about planning. So you will see, for example, if you read through the ISO 27001, the clauses will discuss this, including the performance and the operations and the continuous improvement. So in essence, most of the ISO documentations will use the PDCA stack and the cycle plan, do, check, act, actually to implement security in a continuous way. But that means also that you need to get the support actually of management to get it implemented and take it step by step. So the clause implementation plan, do, check, act is very interesting and to support your security in a continuous way, not only on technical level, but also on managerial level. On the other hand, if you think about security, remember PPT, people, process, and technology, you should think about security controls. A control in English is actually a method to manage security. It's quite important to understand that you need to manage people, you need to manage technology, you need to manage processes and documentation. So it's quite important to make sure that you cover all areas of security implementations. The good news is based on some best practices, including the 2701, for example, of the ISO standards, or SIS controls or the NIST implementations, you can use these documentations and frameworks actually to cover actually all areas of implementation. So it's not only about implementing security, but also about maintaining security. And you see, for example, one of the areas which will be mandatory to implement is also guaranteeing the physical security, even if it's delegated to suppliers. You will be still held accountable for proper security. Just imagine that one of your suppliers is breached. There's a data leak. You will need to report it actually to authorities in many cases, not only the supplier, but you need to report it. So it's quite important to also manage supplier security for that simple reason in many cases. ISO 2701, NIST standards, SIS controls will guide you also checking these boxes to do so. It's quite important to have a helicopter view on the security controls to implement. Another part is to realize that security is not a one-off, so it's quite important to understand that you need to continually maintain your security, so not only the onboarding process, but the change process and the offboarding process. And there's an obvious reasons why I actually signaled the different colors in this process, because mostly the onboarding process is very easy, very short term, and very easy to manage. The change process, and so updating people, changing jobs, changing devices, for example, is a bit more complicated, but still fairly easy to do so. The highly impact security actually is in the ending phase or in the termination phase. So if the termination phase is not executed very well, you will see that people still get access to it while they should not have access to it. People leaving the company still having access, be able to manipulate data. So from a security point of view, the end of life in many cases is quite a dangerous situation. You should pay special attention to this end of life cycle. That's why I usually advise to clean out your security first, meaning people are getting rid of accounts and people actually that are not working for the company anymore, and then working reverse from the end of the cycle to the beginning of the cycle to make sure your security is actually up to date and set correctly in many cases. Right? The main question here is, yeah, how are you managing this security? And as certainly with the cloud security, not everything is managed by you itself anymore, but rather how your suppliers and how your companies delegated control are providing to do so. And in most of the cases, companies are not only maintaining their own data, but also customer data. And due to legislations, for example, cybersecurity legislation in Europe, additional CMMC legislation in the US, for example, in many regions, also including data protection, for example, your customers will be very aware actually of their rights, so they are worried a lot that you manage their data correctly, and that's why, for example, also the cloud security needs to be set correctly. So you should really consider the legislations, making sure that you protect the data, your own data and the customer data correctly, and in many cases. Why am I talking about auditing? There's a very important part in the difference between auditing and monitoring or managing the information. In most of the cases, monitoring is a responsibility of the owner of the system, the company itself. In most of the cases, the monitoring is rather considered as a sort of performance check, which is actually the daily operations, and the person or the company owning the devices, owning the hardware, owning the infrastructure is responsible for monitoring. That is slightly different for auditing because in most of the cases, auditing is about checking the boxes and verifying that you apply actually the security required by legislation, required by contracts, for example. So you are checking if you implement security needed. So that's why it's called a compliance check. Second thing, although due to the new technology, the audits is not executed continuously. So it is executed at regular intervals, once or twice per year, or even more frequently. But you're checking the rules, checking the implementations, and you are checking what the owner is implementing. So very important, a compliance check is always executed by another party than the owner. So you should not check yourself for audit reasons. So it should be always an independent party. By the way, that independent party is not always external, and that's exactly what I wanted to explain also in the various audit types. In a first party, also called internal audit, you're checking yourself. At least the company is checking itself. You should never audit yourself as being the owner doing the audits, but another colleague or another team can still do the audits. And within the internal audits, it's a sort of internal reporting. And in most of the cases, the internal audit report is kept secret within the company. Of course, you can share the details with your colleagues, but it's not shared externally. That is slightly different for a second party audit, and in that case there is a sort of existing relation between two companies. For example, customer versus supplier, or supplier versus the customer. For example, if you want to get a credit at the bank might check your financial situation before granting actually the contract for a credit, for example. Or if you're offering security operations center services, before accepting a customer, you want to make sure that the customer has sufficient management skills or has sufficient infrastructure to implement the security operations center. So as a supplier, you might check up your customer before accepting the customer. That is called a second party audit. The third party audit we all know as an external audit and as a certification audit. In that case, the auditing party, the auditor, will check the results actually for the audit, and you will get an external certificate that you can use to the audience and to show that you're compliant with the certifications you get. And a very typically, for example, ISO audits, and then an external auditor will come and check, will provide an audit, and then will give you a certificate at the end, which you can then use, for example, to publish on your website, for example, and to show to suppliers, to customers that you apply certain rules. In the internal audit, it is rather a self-validation. There is no external party involved here. There is no certificate, and the reporting is usually kept within the company, and you can use it actually to track actually your compliance with in many cases. Please be aware that also the internal audit is mandatory to external audits. And in worst case scenario, if there is a data breach or, for example, an issue with security, even the authorities might require access to the internal audit reporting. So it's quite essential, although kept internal, to provide proper documentations of your internal audits. In most of the cases, the second party audit, so a mutual audit, is between two commercial parties. There is a contractual dependency already in place, but it's really considered as a due diligence process. So even if you acquire a new company, you might do an audit first before completing the purchase or the acquisition actually of a company. That is also called a second party audit. But in essence, there is a primary mutual commercial interest between both parties, and so there is a lot of importance in the dependency between the two parties in many cases. Still, the reporting is kept between these two parties. It's not usually not published to an external party or to the public audience in many cases, and that is different for a third-party audit, where you get an official certificate and you can validate the certificate. It also needs to be maintained in many cases. For example, within the ISO context, it's quite important to understand that certificate, for example, is only valid for 3 years, so it needs to be renewed on a regular basis, right? Very important to understand for audit principles is that an audit is a snapshot of the situation. So the results can be different in 6 months, in a year later. So depending on the situation, it might be very important. Second thing is during audits, you can only see the situation as is. Usually you don't have a lot of time to go in depth with the audit, so you have only limited time to execute the audit, only a few days or even hours in many cases. So you need to prioritize your activities as an auditor. So you need to do some risk management. What are the most important activities? What are the high risk activities? And you focus on these actually to get a proper idea of the situation in many cases, right? Many cases, the audit main principle is solution or resolution or continuous solution based. So actually the purpose of the external audits and the audits is to push the owner of the system to do better every single time. So it's not looking into errors of the system. A very important principle within an audit is that you actually consider the system compliant and you need to prove it. While, for example, a hacker will try to drill into the system, break the system, try to find the gaps into the system to break in many cases, that is not the purpose of the audits in many cases, right? For the audit, also very important to have some hands-on experience, and we will show later on in the 10 red flags today that knowing a bit of cloud security, for example, is quite important. So yeah, even as an auditor, you do need some cloud implementation skills or cloud security skills to do so, right? So let's dive into the results or the red flags that you might see. I selected actually 10 red flags of experience of my audits. Why these 10 red flags? Because these are easy to solve and usually high impact. So with a less effort, getting high impact is a bit of risk management here. But actually these are usually easy to solve, and you can make the life of a hacker very miserable by implementing these red flags. So even with 10 simple solutions, you can actually secure your system quite easily in many cases. And that's why we listed these 10 red flags. Just a small reminder here, because lots of my customers mainly use Microsoft Cloud. I highlighted a few things, by the way, at the end of the presentation. You will see also a lot of practical implementations and suggestions from a Microsoft point of perspective. Please be aware that you can apply the same question, the same approach also to other cloud solutions, private cloud solutions, or even public cloud solutions, like, for example, Amazon AWS or Google or even open cloud solutions. You will see the same behavior, the same issues popping up in many cases, but I took actually from a practical point of view because I'm a bit more comfortable in managing cloud solutions on cloud from Microsoft, and there is a lot of documentation you can easily use, but you can simply replicate the conclusions also to other cloud solutions, right? One of the typical mistakes, and certainly customers taking the first steps in cloud actually is they are using, for example, the email address of the IT administrator, then create an account on the cloud solutions, test a few things, and then go from the test situations immediately or after a few steps into production. But what happens by registering with a personal email address is usually that email address is becoming the first administrator, what I call with God mode access to the system. I can easily show you around. If you log in, for example, the first time with an Azure account, that Azure account will get tenant admin level mode. Meaning it's linked to an email address. And this is for hackers very interesting, because if they can infect, for example, by phishing or sending you fake emails, if you can trick people into clicking on an email using that email address, then getting access to the cloud solution is very easy. So Before you do that, try to resist and to click the registration email. Try to first of all plan a few things and create a special admin account. So create a very specific account first, then register your cloud solution or cloud license, and then very important, enable MFA. By the way, in most of the solutions, you can create an account without an email address, for example, with a specific on Microsoft.com email address. So a tenant name, and then using that email address from the tenant, not your company email address, right? So it's quite important to think about it. Create the email address first, enable it for MFA, and then create the cloud solutions, which will actually make it more resistant, for example, to phishing or hacker issues in many cases, right? In many cases, these cloud solutions will be enabled with user ID and password, although that more and more of these solutions will force you to use strong authentication. You should do it upfront. So make sure that you enable the multi-factor authentication, and very important, also make sure that you have recovery of this user ID and a password, because if you enable a multi-factor authentication, even with passkeys or hardware tokens, please be careful, because what happens if you lose access to these hardware tokens or the passkeys or the MFA? So, for example, if your email address is disabled, or you cannot activate your MFA on your phone, or in worst case scenario, you need to swap your phone because it's lost or stolen. Think about it, what happens if you don't have access to MFA. In most of the cases, you can fill in a recovery email address or a recovery solution, for example, to reactivate your MFA, but please be careful if you do so, that you can reactivate them, even the multi-factor authentications. Just a quick hint, most of the solutions, including Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, will provide a break glass emergency access. So think about the break glass accounts to make sure that if in case your email is infected or the system is infected, that you can still get access to it, right? Another part of the default implementations is the default groups. I don't know if you have looked into the Microsoft Azure environment or Entra, so the identity management of Microsoft Office and Azure. But by default, Microsoft and also Amazon and Google will provide you with a large a volume of groups. Please be careful, because by default you will get lots of access to it. So try to minimize the use of these default groups. Also make sure that you use task-based access control, not function level control, because if you add, for example, a person to domain admin or to the tenant admin, he gets a lot of extra permissions into the system, and a hacker is very fond actually of these accesses. So what you should really do is think about the tasks and the roles that the person needs to execute, and then you can actually make sure that the person only gets access to what actually is needed in many cases. Another thing is identity management. In many cases, people forget about it, but identity management is a life cycle. So usually they give access to a person because the person needs it, or is hired actually in the company and needs to execute the function. But most of the cases, companies forget to remove the access. So there is no process in identity management. You can simply implement a very simple cycle. To implement the procedure. So there should be some checklist, for example, onboarding people, there should be a checklist for changing access controls, and there should be a very explicit checklist for offboarding people. So it's quite important to do so. What you also should not do, and one of the red flags is once people are onboarded, they get a copy of another user working in the same team. Don't do this, right? So make a specific profile, give the users access on what they need. Don't duplicate users, because you risk actually giving too much access to the user. For example, a junior IT engineer should not have the same access as a senior IT engineer. So duplicating the profile of that senior IT engineer is not a good option, right? It's very clear that most of the companies and most of the management of the cloud solutions do not have a process management. So it's quite important to think about the process, what kind of data you need, what kind of actions do you need. So it's quite important to understand what the process is. If you know the process, you know the data, you know the roles that you need, and then you can set up the profiles to do so. And it's a continuous job. By the way, you can easily find this on my GitHub. So I published a few of these diagrams also on GitHub. You can easily get access to it by the presentation. So feel free to get a copy of the presentation, and then you find my GitHub. There is a turtle diagram that you can define, and in essence, it's very interesting because if you manage the process, you can manage the data, and you can access, actually easily manage also the controls in many cases, right? Another issue here is not splitting the admin accounts from the regular Office account. So usually the user account is admin account, and a hacker is very happy with this because if he can infect or get access to the user account, he can easily get access to the admin account. He can easily escalate accounts to the servers and then get access to the entire infrastructure. So due to the fact the Office accounts are usually mail enabled, or used for multiple actions, you give access to hackers actually to also to the administrative accounts, so he can infect the entire systems in that case. So you should really think about splitting the accounts, having a separate account for administrator account, having a separate account for your normal Office operations, and even in many cases you should actually have separate desktops or virtual desktops to do these situations in that case. And that's exactly point number 7. Make sure that you use a separate desktop, or you use a sort of jump station to do the administrative access, which means that actually you should have a specific administrative access which is limited to do some specific controls as an administrator in many cases. In this case, even if you would have an infection, for example, or phishing on your laptop, it should not give you access to administrative environment. So you should, in this way, secure your servers and administrative accounts. Very easy to do so. In many cases, I get feedback, yeah, but I need to have double accounts and so on. But using tools like, for example, a password administrator will help you to do so. It should not be an extra burden to have separate access or separate desktops in many cases. Also for remote access, very important, make sure that you think about RDP, and by preference not using RDP, because the protocol RDP, a remote desktop protocol is very sensitive to attacks. What you better do is using an administrative interface, using, for example, a secure Bastion host, a remote desktop solution, going there by using certificates, having a protected access to it, having multi-factor authentication before you can actually enter the administrative interface. So you're making life visible for the hackers to get access to it. Another thing that's usually forgotten is to segment the network. So make sure that every function in your network, printers, domain controllers, databases, servers, laptops, and so on, are separated. Firewalls in between, and so which is called segmentation. By the way, you can use this very easily, not only in cloud solutions but also in a physical network. So you should actually define the functions and then make sure that actually only the required function can get access, for example, to the proper systems. For example, a normal user should never get direct access to a database server, so you can easily detect using these firewalls anomalies in this traffic. By the way, in most of the cloud solutions, network segmentations is becoming the default, so you should apply this also, and to find anomalies. For example, a hacker that is trying to get access to your database servers can be easily detected by setting up multiple networks, virtual networks, and also setting intrusion detection, prevention, intrusion detection systems actually on the edge of every network. So if a hacker is trying to cross the networks, he should be detected very easily, right? And then of course, last but not least, yeah, make sure that you continuously maintain the configuration. So many companies set up the cloud setup security and then forget about it. So so please be careful. It changes over time. Security changes over time. Hacking changes over time. So threats and security threats evolve. So your configuration should also evolve. So it might be helpful to Provide also updates on the situations, do some additional checks, apply the baselines over time, multiple times a year, or if something changes, you should do a check. Very typically, you should do some threat intelligence, and if there are some notifications, for example, of vulnerabilities, you should really check your security configuration again and then again and again over time. So make a process out of it, which I discussed already in the beginning of the presentation to do so, right? Just a few takeaways here. Make sure that you apply some basic principles. Security doesn't come by default, right? So you need to implement security yourself. Also think about security by design. From the early stages of implementations, you should think about security, making sure that you document it, and also apply the shift left principle. So the earlier you think about security, the better it gets. It's quite important to do so. Also, security by default, implement MFA, strong passwords, making sure that you update your systems regularly. So it's quite important to do so. So keep up with the security issues. It's quite important. And last but not least, think like a hacker. Many regulations now require to do some penetration testing and security testing. In essence, the principle is very simple. Think like a hacker before the hacker itself gets access to your systems, and you need to control the damage. So by locking down the systems, testing your systems regularly, you have a good idea actually how vulnerable the systems are. So keeping up to speed, it becomes way more easier to do so. I mentioned already that at the presentation deck you will see some additional references. There are quite some good documentations, for example, for Microsoft Azure and Azure compliance using the implementation of ISO 27001. So the ISO 27001 is Information Security Management System. It will help you to implement the process and procedure and to implement security. There is also quite some interesting hints and tips also for Microsoft Azure auditing. So what kind of settings you should set up to do the logging and the auditing and to verify security is implemented correctly, and also suggest actually to do some monitoring in many cases. Also from Azure, you will see some hardening, so how to lock down your environment. By the way, if you would look into Google, for example, search for Google hardening or Amazon hardening, you will find exactly the same documentations in many cases. If you want to get some independent suggestions on that one, I would highly suggest to have a look at the ISO 27001 documentations. The 2702 is providing a bit more high-level detailed information, and you can, of course, enrich your management system with the cloud security. And also the 27018 is actually data protection in the cloud. Also, the guidelines provided by the Cloud Security Alliance will help you a lot because they provide you cloud controls matrix, which is pretty similar to the SIS controls provided by the Internet Security Forum to do so. So there are some independent guidances, very easy to use actually to secure your environment, but the Cloud Security Alliance is specifically focused on implementing security in your cloud environment. So have a look at it. You can download the documentation at Cloud Security Alliance for free, so don't hesitate to have a look at it. Very important. Also very important, think about security testing tools, specifically for the Azure environment. You might think about Pink Castle and Purple Knight, specifically Purple Knight. Can be very interesting to verify your security baselines even for your cloud environments, and they will get you some reports so indicating what to improve and to make sure that you can lock down your cloud environments. Specifically also for Azure, very interesting because most people think that if they buy cloud tools that security is included. Please be careful with this because in most of the cases you need to pay additional licenses to get enterprise level of security. So it's quite important to investigate upfront. And when you decide to buy a cloud tool or a cloud platform, what kind of security features you need to add to it. And these platforms I showed you right here, Cloud Architect and M365 Maps, give a very nice overview what kind of features are included to do so. As I told you already, you can actually find quite similar documentations also from other parties like Google and Amazon to make sure. I added also some articles on my blog, so have a look at Identity Underground. It's a WordPress website. It's a bit of my external memory in that case. So I provided some additional hints and tips, for example, also to vulnerability reports to do some threat intelligence. So I hope you can use some of these articles to improve your security of your client environment. Good. We're almost start a bit late, but this should be more or less the 30 minutes we promised actually for the iExperts webinar today. Anyway, feel free if there are any questions, you can contact me. Nuran, I don't know if you want to open up the mics for specific questions, but I have a few minutes left, so we can do that. I see one of the questions, Gerwin. How do you approach cloud security audits across multiple multi-cloud environments? Yes, absolutely. Pretty much the same thing. And let me quickly show you a few things. Skipping the presentations over here. You will see that there's a very strong interest actually in using multiple clouds, because by using multiple clouds, actually the level of security goes up. So more and more customers are combining, for example, Microsoft Cloud with Amazon or Microsoft with Google and so on. But just to give you a quick hint, for example, if you would go for the Google Brick Glass accounts, have a look, just simply Google for Brick Glass. You will get actually the same principles. Here it is. So Brick Glass, for example. So the principles, even cross cloud or cross environment, is the same thing. It adds, in essence, pretty much a bit of complexity, because you need to manage multiple environments, but the principles are exactly the same, Gerben, in that case. It's a bit of extra work, but you will see that in many cases, actually, the type of checks and controls are pretty much the same. Just a quick hint on the level of education, you might also have a look, for example, at the CCAK, which is a certification, for example, hosted by ISACA and the Cloud Security Alliance, which explains exactly these can be used. Another question here by Ahmed is how much of the CSA CCAK can be utilized as a framework for cloud auditing. Yeah, it's quite interesting, because the Cloud Security Alliance actually combines a bit of the audit skills versus the different platforms in many cases. Just a quick hint here, if you want to go cross-platform, what I also can provide is also the SCF framework. And this is exactly a framework that's a secure controls framework. By the way, it's open source. And for example, you can see here that if you go for the downloads, and here it is, and I can show you, as you see, I did not log in actually to the secure controls framework. It's providing you a mapping between the different frameworks, both in frameworks as in best practices. And here we go. So in essence, it's providing you with a sort of method to map actually the different frameworks, both not only in the levels of technical frameworks, but also mapping best practice, for example, syscontrols versus ISO. So have a look at it, secure controls framework. Do not underestimate the file, because you will see that there are over 300 frameworks being mapped in this case. But if you're using multiple frameworks versus multiple technical platforms, you can actually use this kind of information to do so. In essence, by using, for example, the ISO 27001 or the syscontrols or the NIST, actually it doesn't matter what kind of technical platform that you are using, but you can actually apply the same auditing principles to do so. Specifically, the CCAK is a combination of, is a cooperation actually by ISACA and by a Cloud Security Alliance, where ISACA is providing the knowledge on auditing, and where the Cloud Security Alliance is providing a bit more technical background and to do so. So I passed the CCAK quite a while ago, and it helped me a lot to understand the principles. By the way, just a quick hint here, you might also have a look at the CCSK, which is actually the foundation of cloud security knowledge, which is a perfect add-on actually to your cloud auditing experiences. So the CCSK is a sort of foundation of cloud security principles to do so, right? Let me show you the, Mahmoud was asking for the security controls framework. So SCF, or security controls framework, is fully open source, by the way. It should be in the chat right now. So there we go. Good. I will also make sure that I will update the slide deck with the mappings actually to the frameworks I showed you, and the CCAK and the security controls framework will be recorded actually in the slide deck. So good. Any other questions? I think Ahmad's question is answered. Mahmoud, yeah, you had the link, and Gerwin, I hope that I answered your questions. Now I got the confirmation by Gerwin that is clear, right, to him. Good. That's it. Thanks a lot. And yeah, we recorded the session, so you will see some news on the iExperts website very soon. And I will make sure that the iExpert people get the copy